So glad you could make it out this morning, this great weather. Has it been cooling down lately?
Yeah.
Yesterday in Joplin, at least, it was really starting to feel like fall.
Yeah.
And so that's just fun. I really like fall. But nice. I'm glad you could make it out this morning because I'm not sure how much you were paying attention to the scripture reading, but it's a good part of the book. It's a really good story this morning. So we've been walking through Esther the last 4 weeks, and today marks the 5th week. And so just last week we were at the height of the plot, the climax of the story, and now today we get to see everything kind of take place. And so it's a good day today. So to recap briefly the story with you, chapter 1, we meet King Xerxes, who's this awful king. We find that the kingdom of Persia really is hopeless. There's no hope to be found. Then in chapter 2, we're introduced to Mordecai and Esther, who give us a glimpse of hope, that good people still do exist here. In chapter 3, we're introduced to the evil villain Haman, who then makes the edict to kill all the Jews in chapter 3. Then in chapter 4, and then into 5 a little bit last week, we saw Mordecai and Esther try to devise a plan to try and save the Jews. So we left off last week with Esther finally deciding that she was going to do the right thing. She decided she wasn't just going to stay nice and safe in her castle. She decided to do the right thing, to save her people from being killed. She takes a risk and goes before the king. Even though she hadn't been summoned, she could be killed for this, but she did it. She went and it worked out. And the king accepts her into his presence. And then he asks her, what is it you want? Even up to half the kingdom, it says, it will be granted to you. And she doesn't say what she wants. She kind of baits him a little bit and says, I'm going to throw you a banquet. Come to the banquet, and then I'll tell you. And so then they go to the banquet. She prepares it, and they're all there. Xerxes and Haman and Esther. And then once again, the king asks, hey, what is it you want? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you. But even still, the second time she waits. She notices that the king, he's been drinking a little bit, probably not the best time right now to ask this question. And so that kind of brings us to this morning. The plot of the storyline of the last chapter was prolonged purposely to heighten the suspense of this coming chapter that we will cover today. Many scholars have made multiple comments on this section of Esther. They've said things to describe Esther with comments like, one of the most ironic comic scenes in the entire Bible. And things like, one of the funniest stories you'll find anywhere in the Bible. In our story today, there is some immense irony and comedy that just is incredible. So now you will see why this is one of my favorite books in the Bible. So let's jump in and start to see our story unravel here in verse 9 of chapter 5. Let's read verse 9 and then the first half of 10. Haman went out that day in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. So now we kind of get to see Haman's perspective on Esther's banquets that she's throwing. So we know Haman pretty well by now. We kind of know the type of guy he is. So Esther invites him to this banquet. And, oh man, he really likes that. Like, oh, the queen is inviting me to a private banquet with just her and the king. I am something special. So he loves that she invited him to this, and it really strokes his ego. He really likes it. And so the author tells us that Haman left the banquet happy and high in spirits. The fact that the queen, Esther, would invite him, he's really thinking highly of himself right now. And so he leaves the banquet feeling really good about himself, and then he goes to see Mordecai. Mordecai's still at the gate, and he still won't bow down to him. He still won't give him honor. And this really bugs Haman. Everyone else is giving me honor. Everyone else respects me except you. Why? Why don't you respect me? And so let's see what he does, continuing in verse 10. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth and his many sons, and all the ways that the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see the Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. Man, Haman is something, isn't he? We really see what matters to Haman. we see his priorities. We see the three main things that he cares about. It says that he likes his many sons, and his vast wealth, and all the ways that the king has honored him. These three things are the essence of Haman. This is all he cares about. This is his heart. He's so proud of these things. So let's see his friend's response. Verse 14, his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, have a pole, or in some translations says a gallows, set up, reaching to a height of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the gallows set up. I just have a hard time grasping this answer by his wife and his friends. Basically, they're saying, man, you don't like this guy? Kill him. You don't like him? Just get rid of him. Who cares? It doesn't matter. You really get a perspective of these people and their view of the world. You know, they're sitting way up high. They're wealthy. They've got power. They've got everything. So if they don't like something, just get it done. No big deal. And so just the audacity of his wife just to say, set up a gallows and just have him murdered. No big deal. That's crazy. That is unreal. So let's move on to chapter 6, here in verse 1. That night the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. Now I think this is just hilarious. So the king, he can't sleep, he's laying in bed, and he calls in his servant, and his servant comes in with this big book, literally a book about King Xerxes and how great he is. Like, this man can't sleep, so they have a book read to him. They read a story to him about him to help him fall asleep. Like, this is ridiculous. But this is huge. Do you remember chapter 3, at the end of chapter 3, when Mordecai saves King Xerxes from the assassination plot? But if you remember, nothing was done to him. Nothing was given to him. He wasn't honored for it. But now the servant is reading about Mordecai and what he did. So let's find out what happens. Verse 3. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. The king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he had set up for him. His attendants answered, Haman is standing in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, who is there the king would rather honor than me? So the king is now reminded that Mordecai did this good deed for him. He saved his life. And then he gets distracted, and he hears a noise outside. He's like, who's out there? Who's in the court? And the servant looks out and picks up the window, and he's like, oh, it's Haman. And so the king is kind of thinking about, what should I do to Mordecai? And so he realizes Haman, his trusty servant, right-hand man, is right outside. So he goes, oh, bring him in. I'll ask him what I should do to Mordecai. I'll ask him. But notice the exact wording of his question that King Xerxes asked Haman. He says, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? He just says the man. He doesn't clarify who he's talking about. He's very vague. And oh man, we know Haman well enough by now to know, what he's thinking. So he's thinking, who would the king rather honor than me? He's got to be talking about me, surely. And so let's see what Haman thinks should be done. Verse 7. So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. And then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. So Haman gets a little carried away here. He's kind of just in his own head, and he's like, man, what would I really like right now? And this is what he wants. He wants to be honored. He wants to get this public admiration in front of everyone. He wants the respect of everyone. So let's see the king's response in verse 10. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested. To the Jew Mordecai. who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. Oh my word. I can just picture Haman's face just dropping in shock.
Yeah.
Like, what? Are you kidding me? This guy? Why not me? I'm amazing. I do everything. But this guy who, is like wearing a sack probably still, with ashes all over his face. You want this guy? Are you serious? Not only does Haman he doesn't get publicly honored, but he now has to honor his worst enemy, Mordecai. That is hilarious. I love this. This is great. I like this story. So let's see if he goes through with it. Verse 11. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He rode Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." So embarrassing. The irony here is incredible. I love it. You just naturally want this to happen to Haman, just because of the type of character he is. Nobody likes Haman. So to see him get embarrassed like this is fantastic. So let's finish the chapter, verse 12. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief and told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. He will surely come to ruin you." While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuch arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. So after all that backstory, we're now back to the main plot here. We're back to the second banquet, the third time that Esther will, hopefully be able to answer to the king what she wants. The second banquet, Haman gets pulled away to it. So will she do it this third time? Will she do it? Let's read chapter 7, verse 1. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet, and as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request, even up to half the kingdom that will be granted?" Now is your chance. Please say it now. This is your third time. We're waiting. Will she do it? Verse 3. The king answered. Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet. But because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Who is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing?" Esther said, "An adversary, an enemy, this vile Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A gallows reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." The king said, "Impale him on it." So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. Dang. It's pretty good. What a series of events. Esther here does an absolutely incredible job persuading the king to get what she wants. She says it in such a way that she makes it seem like the king and her are on the same team and Haman is against them. She says if it pleases the king, we see that a lot, trying to win his favor. So she kind of gets behind that and kind of plays that into her favor and kind of pits them against each other. She does such a good job. And the king naturally responds with, "Well, who would dare try to kill my queen? Who would do such a thing?" And then Esther responds with, "This vile Haman." And I love the response of Haman. It just says Haman was terrified. He was terrified. His heart must have dropped. Oh, man. And then the king is mad when it says in verse 7 that the king got up and left his wine. We know how much King Xerxes loves his wine. But he leaves it on the table and goes out into the garden because he's just so mad he just can't even think. my favorite part here. Just when he thought things couldn't get any worse for Haman. It says in verse 8, it says that Haman, as a last resort, goes and tries to beg Esther for his life. But he ends up tripping and falling on Esther right at the same time that the king comes in. And it looks like Haman's trying to force himself on her. So it makes him look even worse. And the king's like, what are you doing? And so, things couldn't get any worse, but then it got worse. And so that happened. And so with poetic justice, Haman is hung on the same gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. It's amazing. What a story. So I think that there are a couple things that we can get from the story that we can miss if we're not paying close attention. First, I just want to say that I think it's pretty obvious that God is at work in the lives of Esther and Mordecai and all the Jews. I think he's evidently at work. The ridiculous coincidences that happen are just insane. Haman decides to set up a gallows to hang Mordecai on, and coincidentally, that night, the king can't sleep. And actually, in some translations, verse 1 of chapter 6, some translations would even word it to say, the Lord kept the king from sleep. It was the Lord that kept him from sleeping that night. And then, coincidentally, the section of the Chronicles of Xerxes that the servant read him was of Mordecai, reminding him that Mordecai saved his life, coincidentally. And then the next day, Haman is humiliated and has to honor Haman. This all happened in a 24-hour period. And then Esther tells the king about Haman's evil plan, and then he gets hung for it. All in 24 hours. That's crazy. One of the main themes of Esther is knowing that God is at work. He was in control. And he will accomplish his will for the good of his people, even if we can't see it. Because remember, God, the word God, it doesn't even start to mention in Esther. But he's still at work. He's still there. Even in our lives when we think everything is going wrong, God is at work. He is in control. He will get his will completed. He is making you a stronger person, even when things are falling apart. Another detail that I think is interesting is actually back in chapter 5, when Haman is boasting to his friends. Let's read verse 10 through 13 of chapter 5 again. Nevertheless, it says, Haman restrained himself and went home. Calling together his friends and Zeresh his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. Here, we don't just get a deep insight of Haman's soul, his true person. We get an insight of the human soul. Our soul. Sometimes we miss undertones in the English translation, and I think this is one of those. When it says that Haman boasted to them, the Hebrew word for boasted is the word safar. The original meaning of this word really brings out Haman's pride and just his infatuation with himself. Basically, the phrase, instead of just saying Haman boasted to them, in Hebrew it would read something like this. It would read, Haman is found to be gathering people around him to tell them things they already know. To tell them things that they already know. This really brings out the true pride of Haman. But I want to ask you, how many of us are just like Haman? How many of us do the same thing? How often do we boast and try to make ourselves look better than we really are? How many times do we tell people things that they probably already know, but we just want to make sure that they know how great we are, because that's what's important. Haman is so deeply prideful. He's a deeply prideful man. But so are we. Haman cannot get enough of himself, but neither can we. We love ourselves. We cannot get enough of ourselves. Without the gospel, our world leaves us searching for meaning and fulfillment in things that just simply do not matter. Things like people's perceptions and what they think of us. One of my favorite quotes is in the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. I've actually used this in a sermon last year here, but it just fits perfectly. I love it. I just want to read it again. It says, if the only vision we have of ourselves comes from the social mirror, from the current social paradigm, and from the opinions, perceptions, and the paradigms of the people around us, what they think of us. Our view of ourselves is like a reflection in the crazy mirror room at the carnival. We will never see our true selves. We will never find out who we really are if who we find ourselves is in the opinions of others. It's impossible. We laugh at the life of Haman because he's an awful person who gets what he deserves. We can laugh that off because it's easy. But how many of us are just like him? How many of us are just like him? How many of us form our identity on our achievements? How many of us form our identity on our job? How many of us form our identity on our performance? I'm guilty of that. Only with the gospel can we find our true identity. Tim Keller, in his book, Center Church, he says this. He says, without the gospel, our self-image is based on living up to some standards, either our own or someone else's imposed on us. If we live up to those standards, we will be confident, but not humble. If we don't live up to them, we will be humble, but not confident. Only in the gospel can we be both enormously bold and utterly sensitive and humble. Only within the gospel can we find our true identity. Our identity is found in what Jesus did. Our identity is found in what he already did, not on what we will do. It's on what he did on the cross. This means that our identity is not found in how good we are. It's not found in how often we come to church, how much money we put in the offering bucket. It's not found in our performance. Because it's found in Jesus' performance. It's found in Jesus' dying on the cross for you. And even though it may not seem like it, God is at work in you. To help you love him and love others more through the gospel. Let's pray. Lord, help us in our pride. Lord, I think of John 3:30. He must become greater, I must become less. I pray that we would meditate on that. And I pray that that would become true in our lives. Because it is such a hard thing to do, to deny ourselves and take up our cross. Thank you for giving us the perfect example of how we should live. Lord, help us to live in the gospel. Help us to share that gospel with others. Lord, thank you for working in us, even though we may not see it. We're so thankful for you and your Son. It's in your name I pray. Amen.
For our decision hymn will be standing.